The Manhattan fog was thick and dark the next morning. People around the world were hopeless, but something had to be done. United Nations leaders from around the world gathered in Manhattan along with the Sentinel, Matrona, and Kogar to discuss what the official response plan of Earth would be. The room was split. One side sat UN officials, and on the other sat 7 Gars. Between them sat Quinn Carter. These Gars were representative of Japico City's loyalists. Kogar led the group, and with him were his colleagues, Quogar, Froklagar, Eogar, Grandalgar, Dogar, and Zygar. The Sentinel sat behind the world leaders, and Matrona sat in the corner, watching over the meeting. Italy's representative spoke with concern trembling through his voice. What bothers me most is the secrecy that Rogar is capable of. He managed to hide a massive machine in the center of Rome since ancient times. What else could he be able to do? There's no hope, he wailed as he pressed his finger against the table. England's Prime Minister stood next, slamming the table as she rose. I say we destroy them until they flee. Zygar's thin black eyebrows furrowed in anger at the statement. He floated up defensively. There are plenty of good, honest Gars on Ilias Epherium. You can't just kill the innocent to get rid of the few bad ones. And for the sake of what, your planet? That's insanity. He hissed behind serrated teeth, angrily blinking his bright yellow eyes. This is more complicated than you can perceive. Rogar fights for the originals, and for the gods. He seeks to keep the Gars safe, and he feels that Earth is the best place to do that. Fighting will do nothing but anger him. Your best bet is peace talks. Let them assimilate. He warned what would happen should you refuse, and you aim to ensure he keeps that promise? A space lizard from your planet is trying to destroy our planet, the representative of Brazil pointed out. Peace talks are out of the question. Zygar snarled at the Brazilian representative. The US president stood up. What else do you propose we do then? It's the easiest option for survival. We'd all have to simply adjust to this new normal. Canada's prime minister stood up and added, it would be one thing if the Gars were seeking refuge, but it's another entirely that they are claiming ownership. But what options do we have? That's enough! Froklagar floated upwards with such gusto that his chair fell over, silencing the room. This isn't an Earth matter. It isn't even an Ilias Epherium matter. This is a galactic issue. We must act united. Rogar does not speak for all of us. We can stop him together. There has to be another way. Perhaps divine intervention is necessary. Divine intervention? Quinn questioned. As far as I'm concerned, Froklagar, there is no god. Not yours, human. The Gar shook his head. The Extraversal Council, of course. Quinn crossed her arms. They won't be of much help. You don't know them, Froklagar growled. You'd be surprised, pal. This is war. The Sentinel shook his head. Rogar's not one for bargaining. He's going to attack whether we do or not. So let's not make things more complicated than they already are. The war can't happen without their plan working. We could try to destroy all the machines. The Sentinel suggested with confidence. Indestructible, said Russia's representative. The sense of urgency that once filled the room was quickly replaced by an overwhelming feeling of hopelessness. We nuked one. In the middle of our tundra. It did nothing. Civilians have tried breaking them in riots. Nothing can take these down. The president of France spoke softly. Those machines are built from the strongest material Rogar's goons could harvest from Ilias Epherium's core. May as well be the strongest material in the universe as far as you're concerned. Eogar spoke up. Nothing short of the concentrated power of a black star can blast through Calcarus B. And even then, the Gar stone that lines it prevents any plasmatic attack. Quogar and I dealt with the stuff millennia ago, we should know. Those machines might as well be a permanent fixture of this planet now. Unless you want your planet to be destroyed by a black star. He turned his attention to the rest of the meeting room. We'll have to plan a way around them. Matrona interrupted calmly, saying, why not just come to them before they're ready? Rogar and his army expect us to sit back and wait 6 months for them to come to us, but we could attack first. We can't just let him threaten us without so much as a response. How? Russia's representative stood up, slamming his fist onto the table. We don't have the technology to transport troops to another planet that quickly. Or at all, spoke the president of Mexico. Teleportation? Matrona looked expectantly at the Sentinel. I can't do that yet, it's way too many people, he responded. I wouldn't want to accidentally send them to the Cretaceous. What about rockets? Korea's representative added. Earth rockets are too slow, Froklagar answered. As opposed to Gar rockets? France's representative asked. But how would we get them to you without Rogar finding out? Dogar asked. The Sentinel, Grandalgar interrupted. He can teleport there with Kogar and steal a few rockets. Or, the safer route, Germany's representative began. How many Gar scientists do you have on your side? Quogar and I, Yogar answered. Then teach us. Egypt's representative chimed in. Couldn't be that hard, right? With what time? Are you crazy? Finland's prime minister scoffed. We could do it, China's representative interrupted. Easily if he taught all our scientists, Japan continued. So you're expecting us to learn alien technology and apply it to rockets, then fill those rockets with troops from around the world and send them to a planet that's God knows how far away in less than 6 months? Spain's representative questioned. Why not? Australia's prime minister sat back in his chair, chewing on his pen. Against all odds, the first rockets were completed just 2 months after the meeting in Manhattan. The UN decided which armies would go to battle in Elysium first. They decided on the armies of the US, Canada, China, the UK, France, Germany, and Russia. The Sentinel and Kogar counted as their own nation's army on paper. Quinn, the Sentinel expert of the White House, put them down under the Sentinel's army. Matrona wanted to help, but the Sentinel urged her to stay back on Earth for her own safety. 3 months into the countdown, they were ready for departure. Matrona was there at the landing ground to see them off. A squadron of 5,000 men was sent in one ship to represent the U.S. The Sentinel and Kogar sat near the entrance and waved to Matrona as the door closed, and the plane-like ship took off, zooming towards Elysium. This doesn't feel right. Kogar broke a long silence after takeoff. Fighting in a war. He turned to face the Sentinel. In all the time the Gars lived on Elysium, not since the War of the Originals have we fought. We were a peaceful people. Then came Rogar and, well, here we are. Wish I could say the same about humans. The Sentinel looked down at the weapon he was given. Tons of civil wars and revolutions, petty wars and border wars, 2 world wars, and now this. A galactic war. Kogar responded. Right. The Sentinel chuckled. We can win this. He looked up at Kogar, then gestured toward his box. I know we can. This will be over before we know it. Quinn Carter walked in the soldier holding room. She scanned over the faces of the soldiers looking defeated. Attention! She yelled. All the soldiers stood up and saluted. It took the Sentinel and Kogar a few moments before they too stood up and saluted. France's ship is down. Quinn struggled to deliver the news. She cleared her throat. No casualties in Rogar's army. She stood tall. There's still hope. She paced back and forth. We should be landing at the same time as Russia and Canada. Power in numbers. She turned to walk out, but before she did, she turned around and stared directly at the Sentinel. Don't let Earth down. Don't let Elysium down. Be the Sentinel I know. She walked out of the room, and everyone sat down except the Sentinel. He stood, realizing how much responsibility rested on him and him alone to save the world, and yet, he didn't even know if he could. A voice came across the onboard announcement system. Landing sequence engaged. This is it. Kogar looked at the Sentinel. Yup. The Sentinel cleared his throat. Let's just hope I don't blow everything up, he said, louder than he had hoped. A soldier heard him and looked at him fearfully. What? She asked. Sorry, the Sentinel responded. The ship made a rough landing. The large hatch door swung open, and all the soldiers rushed out, yelling. As the Sentinel ran out of the ship, he turned to his right and noticed that the Russian and German ships had also landed. 3 ships worth of 5,000 people each rushed towards Rogar's army of nearly 500, surrounding Sogar's temple. The Gars outclassed the humans just with their anatomy alone. The Sentinel dropped off the ship and made his way toward the center of the battlefield. By the time he made it, the battlefield around him was littered with bodies, and the Gars were left without much of a scratch in their numbers. As eyes turned to him, he placed a hand on the ground. A flash of purple blasted through the ground, and chunks of stone shot outwards in waves, pushing all the Gars back. He looked around for any sign of Rogar. Rogar landed directly in front of the Sentinel. He turned around with a fling of his tail, smashing the Sentinel into the ground. The Sentinel's vision blurred. He blinked quickly and stood up, rubbing his eyes and looking around for Rogar again. He pushed himself into the air using his flames and fell on top of a Gar's back. Billowing flames from the Gar's mouth spewed around the battlefield. The Sentinel grew crystalline spikes of plasma from his wrists and forced them into the Gar's head. He jumped off and made his way to Rogar again. He looked across a deep, narrow canyon and saw Rogar.
I'm surprised, Sentinel.
He laughed.
I didn't expect you to put up a fight. Are you human?
Yes?
Why don't you die like one?
Rogar asked. He opened his mouth wide. A concentrated beam of plasma blasted the Sentinel, pushing dust up into the air and shaking the ground around him. When the dust settled and the flames dissipated, a circle of scorched dirt was left behind. Rogar looked confusedly at the spot, only to see the Sentinel still standing there. The box was planted firmly in the ground, and a lime-green dome force field emanated from it. The Sentinel looked up at Rogar. The Sentinel's surprise shifted into an overconfident smirk. My turn. He placed his hand on the box, the shield lowered. Putting his hand up, he shot an identical beam as Rogar's to him from his palm. Rogar quickly blasted back, and the beams pushed at each other, struggling to move closer to either of them. Kogar spotted them from a distance. He flew quickly to Rogar and slammed into him. They rolled onto the ground. The Sentinel stood up and rushed his way over to them, but it was too late. Before he could comprehend the appalling amount of blood, he stopped in his tracks. The strange liquid flowed through the ground into the Sentinel. It was pitch black. The Sentinel looked up and saw Rogar's horns deeply impaled into Kogar's chest. Rogar pushed his head forward and sliced down Kogar's body. His limp body fell to the ground. The Sentinel ran towards him, each step splashed in his best friend's blood. The blood glowed a pure white with each footprint left behind. Rogar blew plasma into a wall around him and the body.
He was a traitor.
Rogar spat.
He had every chance to see the light, and he died fighting for the wrong side of history. It's a shame.
The Sentinel held up his left arm, exposing his exoskeletal gauntlet. He grabbed the base of the armor. He tore the gauntlet off and threw it down a narrow canyon, clanging against its walls as it fell, echoing through the desert. Rogar raised a brow. It doesn't help me control plasma. It contains me. The Sentinel placed his hand down on the ground, and his eyes glowed a deep purple. The ground underneath Rogar burst with immense pressure, and a beam of plasma energy shot up into the sky. The ground rose, creating a mound. The inferno began to consume the surrounding area, and the Sentinel surrounded himself with a box of shield to stave off the flames. The shield contained Kogar's body as well. The Sentinel held onto Kogar's arm and flashed away with the box, leaving the planet and the war he swore to fight. He appeared at the army base, near the takeoff location with Kogar's body. Sentinel! Matrona spotted him immediately. She ran to him, arms open for a hug, but quickly stopped after noticing Kogar's bleeding body. The Sentinel held onto Kogar tightly, turning and yelling. Medic! He cried. He's dying! We need a medic! Government personnel and soldiers gathered around the Sentinel and Kogar. Matrona stepped a little closer. Sentinel! Kogar lifted his hand up. Promise me you won't give up. Come on, Kogar. The Sentinel begged with a trembling voice. Stay with me. I need to remember. You're all I have of those years. I'm not. Kogar coughed. Don't die. Don't be those guys who live just long enough to say a few words and then die. You're better than that. The Sentinel cried. Kogar laughed weakly. I'm afraid I'm not. He smiled. No, Kogar. No! The Sentinel watched as the life drained from his eyes and his body grew even more limp. The Sentinel pled. Medic! He paused, teary-eyed. Please. Please. He trembled quietly, finally breaking down and laying his head on Kogar's forehead. Please. Sentinel? Matrona spoke comfortingly towards the Sentinel. No! He yelled. Get out! He cried into Kogar's body, holding him tight. Matrona hesitated for a second, holding out her arm, before she stepped back and made her way through the crowds of people. The end of the final month neared, and even days after Kogar's death, the Sentinel had to stay concentrated in his work. He tried to improve his technology to help aid in the war. His box's size reduced again. He retrieved his disintegration gun from his toolbox, where he kept it since the run-in with the astronaut, and he holstered it on his jeans. He created small black patches on his hoodie, one on each elbow, one for each shoulder, and one on top of the hood, a strip around the waist, and around both sleeve cuffs. The patches acted as an electromagnetic field, allowing the box to float around the Sentinel freely. He was distraught over Kogar's death. He tried his best to remember the good times they had, and yet nothing resurfaced. He had hardly known him in reality. That's what crushed him the most. He could have known him better. He should have. Kogar died at the side of his best friend. The Sentinel watched a stranger die. Despite his new and improved technology, the Sentinel eventually stopped fighting, refusing to get back into battle. He cared for Matrona, keeping her secluded and safe. He couldn't be the best friend he could to Kogar. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. He needed to be the best father he could for Matrona. The armies of the war learned of Rogar's remarkable survival from the Sentinel's blast, and since then, the people of Earth lost every battle on Elusiferium. With very few days left before Elusiferium would be in range of Earth's orbit, the outlook was bleak. Every night, the Sentinel and everybody else on Earth was forced to look up at the night sky and see the planet that would mean their deaths in the near future. The Sentinel desperately tried to think up any planet at all that could spell victory for Earth and the peaceful Gars. He couldn't think of anything. Kogar's death weighed too much on his mind. Matrona approached him in his lab. Sentinel? She sat down next to him. You okay? She asked. The Sentinel sat with his head on the counter. The box floated around his head. He pushed it, causing it to rotate quickly around him. He sat up. Haven't slept in days. What's on your mind? Besides... Yeah, I know. He sniffled. We should run away, Matrona. What? The Earth is doomed. I've got a time machine. We could go back, Live in some sort of past or something, wait it out. I could be the father you always wanted. It could be nice. The Sentinel shrugged. It would buy us some time. Sentinel, you can't just leave them. You're their most important asset. Their only hope for victory. Why would you even think that? I was gone for 5 years, and you only missed me for 2 weeks. I could do it again. I could save you at least. Sentinel. I don't want to lose you too, Matrona. The Sentinel looked at her. I don't know what I would do if I let anything happen to you. You deserve more. I ruined your life as Adam, and I need to make up for that. Matrona didn't know what to say. She stood up and walked past him, stepping outside. The Sentinel looked up at his box. What do I do, Kogar? The box bobbed up and down in front of him. The Sentinel dropped his head into his arms and fell asleep, sitting down at the counter. The 6 months were spent. Iliospherium sat in the sky as big as the full moon. The beams of light from the machine subsided after 6 months of activity. The whole world grew silent and uneasy when they switched off. The armies of the world stood ready. The Sentinel returned from one final reluctant military mission. Matrona was eager to see him fighting again, but she could tell he wouldn't keep up. He began to lead her back to the basement. Sentinel, Matrona stopped him, looking into his eyes. You need to be out there. I can't, he blurted out, interrupting Matrona. I'm not ready. Their entire world is hinging on me. I could let them down. If you never try, how will you live up to the stories? Go out there and fight. The people need you. These people need a savior, not some clueless scientist. The people need a guardian. You're supposed to be it. Why? Does it matter? The Sentinel took a deep breath. All right. He puffed out his chest. Stay safe. Don't go outside. He handed Matrona his disintegration gun. Just in case. Hey, Matrona looked at the Sentinel. He turned around. I love you, Dad. The Sentinel paused. Like Kogar, he knew he and Matrona were close, but his memories were far and few between. Matrona may have seen him as her father, and he was trying his best to be that, but in reality, he hardly knew her. He opened his mouth to say something before he knew what it was he was going to say. Matrona looked over his face. She sighed. I know. The Sentinel flashed away. He appeared on the edge of his beachside cliff. The box glowed, and a transmission buzzed through it. It was a message from Quinn. Sentinel, soldier, what are you doing out there? We can see you. What? How? The Sentinel asked, looking around. We were surveying your house for threats. Oh, right. Well, I figured that Rogar will be after me first. I'll keep him away from everyone else and deal with him, hopefully. That's crazy. You could get yourself killed, Quinn warned. I know what I'm doing, he said stubbornly. Box, cut all transmissions. The box stopped glowing, and the transmission was cut. The Sentinel stood strong, waiting. Almost an hour later, Gar's ships could be spotted in the distance. The ships were bombarded by rockets and missiles from Earth, but they were mostly unaffected. The Sentinel was confident in Earth's defenses, however. They didn't need him. All he needed to do was rid the war of Rogar, and the pieces would fall into place. The Sentinel heard a flash behind him. He turned around. Rogar floated through a portal from Iliospherium.
Here we go again, Sentinel.
Rogar floated around him.
I have to admit, you're better than I thought.
He laughed.
But you're nothing I can't handle.
The portal closed behind him. You killed my friend, Rogar. You've killed a lot of us, and for what? More land? Pathetic.
Saranith, you killed Gars.
For the betterment of your species and mine. I think of the important things. I hardly think that another piece of dirt added to my collection is more important than a life.
Humans sure are funny. Hypocritical, too. It isn't as simple as that. You should know it never is.
Leave. Now, the Sentinel demanded, standing his ground. Rogar was prepared to attack when a laser hit him in the face, with no effect. The Sentinel turned around in fear, recognizing the laser. Matrona! He yelled. Get back inside, now! No, Sentinel, I can fight! Rogar laughed.
The girl wants to fight?
Matrona, please, he's more dangerous than you think. You saw what I could do, let me fight! Rogar blew plasma towards Matrona. The Sentinel quickly flicked his arm upwards. A wall of solid plasma popped up from the ground and shielded them, then fell back down. Matrona, please! The Sentinel turned around to face Rogar. He threw balls of plasma at Rogar and he dodged all of them. The Sentinel jumped at him, stabbing solid plasma spikes in and out of Rogar's side. Rogar flicked his tail, knocking the Sentinel off and sliding him across the ground. He slid until his head dangled over the edge of the cliff. Sentinel! Matrona yelled. Matrona, please, get inside, run! Rogar flicked his tail again, pushing the Sentinel off the cliff. Sentinel! Matrona yelled, running forward. Rogar spun around, slamming his tail against her and pinning her to the ground. He pushed her up against the wall of the lab. Matrona cried out and strained her head to watch the cliff for any sign of the Sentinel. Plasma glowed behind Rogar's teeth as it began charging up a blast beam of plasma. When Matrona smiled, the glow behind Rogar's teeth dimmed. He turned around. The Sentinel floated above the cliff. Bright purple wings flapped on his back. They dissolved into purple sparks, and he landed on his knee, hand pressed against the ground. Didn't even know I could do that, he remarked, standing up. Rogar lifted his tail from Matrona and launched himself at the Sentinel, picking him up, then diving down the cliff. He slammed the Sentinel into the beach below and slid him across it. The plummet surely would have killed him. The plasma coursing through the Sentinel's veins seemed to have taken the brunt of the force. The Sentinel escaped Rogar's grasp. Rogar slithered across the ground, leaving a track in the beach. He floated upwards as he approached the Sentinel. Rogar began. He was interrupted by the Sentinel launching a ball of plasma at the cliffside. Rocks fell from the cliff onto Rogar. Rogar tried to dodge a few, but one large rock knocked him over, and he fell into the waves. He tried to float back up, but a rock wedged his tail into the ground. He blasted a burst of plasma to the rock, destroying it. His face dripped with blood. He was breathing heavily. Rogar, give up. Leave this planet. The Sentinel stood up, weak. There are other ways to protect the Gars. There are other planets. I don't get what your obsession is with invasion. Rogar wiped the blood from his face.
I fought my whole life for this. I won't give up now. I can't afford to.
Yeah, I figured as much. The Sentinel sighed. He ran to Rogar, jumping onto his head, using it to launch himself onto the cliff. He began to climb. Rogar followed him, grabbing him with his talons. That was what the Sentinel wanted. They flew above the cliff, and the Sentinel blasted a beam of plasma through Rogar's hand, burning it. Rogar roared in pain, letting the Sentinel go. He fell and rolled across the ground near the edge of the cliff again. Matrona was still there, watching. The Sentinel stood up in pain. Run! The Sentinel froze in place, petrified as Rogar floated behind Matrona. Matrona! He yelled, panicked. Go! The Sentinel ran towards Matrona, but before he could do anything, Rogar wrapped his tail around her and began to suffocate her. The Sentinel tried to part her from the tail, but she didn't budge.
The planet for the girl!
Rogar roared.
Give up and I will spare her.
Matrona's face grew red, and the Sentinel became desperate. He blasted a hole through Rogar's tail, but as Rogar unwrapped her from the pain in his tail, he flinched. He saw that the Sentinel realized what he had done. The flames burrowed too deep. Matrona looked up at the Sentinel. A single tear dropped down her face as she fell to her knees. The Sentinel fell to catch her. Matrona, he began. Sentinel. She looked down at the hole through her abdomen. Oh, God. I didn't mean to. He paused, breathing heavily, holding back tears. Matrona. His mind raced. Memories seemed to leak back in the moment of trauma. Matrona's terrified and helpless face brought something out in him, and for a moment he saw his daughter. I love you. His vision blurred, tears rolled down his face. Matrona shook her head, crying. A stinging pain swallowed her whole. I did too, Matrona cried. Her head fell limp. The Sentinel let her body rest on the ground. As he stood up, he turned angrily towards Rogar. Rogar floated back, holding his hand to the wound in his tail. He grimaced at the Sentinel. The Sentinel's eyes glowed a deep purple. He launched himself at such speed that he could only be seen as a blur of purple. Rogar fell to the ground, winded. Looking up at the Sentinel, Rogar fell through his portal and vanished. The Sentinel fell to his knees and looked up to the sky. Coward! He screamed. His voice echoed through the night. He turned to face the city. The guards were retreating. The humans were winning. He looked at Matrona's body, then up at Iliusopherium. His eyes flared, and he sped into his lab. He rummaged through cabinets and came across 2 of his small bombs, powerful enough to decimate Iliusopherium. His past flashed before his eyes as he looked down upon his mistakes. Wrongs needed to be corrected for. He looked at his box. He ran outside, stopping by Matrona's body. I'm sorry, he whispered. Looking up at the sky, the ground below him rumbled. Purple light seemed to burst from the ground and the floor exploded, launching him directly upwards at the approaching planet. The Sentinel flew through space faster than a rocket. He approached Iliusopherium, and before he entered their atmosphere, time seemed to come to a grinding halt. He opened his teary eyes, gazing at the landscape below, and pondering over what had happened. He let go of the bombs, turned around, and grabbed his box. Time seemed to flow naturally again as he flashed away above Earth's atmosphere. He needed to give himself time to slow down. He was falling back to Earth's surface at incredible speeds. He pushed plasma from his hands and feet as counter-propulsion to slow himself down, but he couldn't slow himself enough. He desperately tried to bring back his wings and succeeded for a mere second, but he was too late. He hit the ground with a resounding thud. A shockwave blasted from the impact. It was a miracle that he didn't die in an instant, but he knew he was dying. He was okay with his fate. This wasn't a life worth living anymore. He had done his duty. From what he could make out through the dust and tears in his eyes, the cloaked man had returned. The man stood near the Sentinel. The Sentinel tried to get a word out, but he was losing consciousness. He heard words from multiple people, but nothing coherent. The only words he could make out were, another chance. And then everything went dark. The Sentinel woke up and surveyed his surroundings. He felt fine. He could tell he was in a hospital room, cold and dark. Was I dreaming? He thought to himself, trying to figure out where he was. He sat up in a hospital bed. Quinn Carter was in the room. Quinn? Where am I? What? He stopped talking and moved his tongue around in his mouth. Why do I sound different? He turned his head and saw another hospital bed. On it lay a body bag, just being zipped up. A man stood by it, staring at it. Is that? Matrona. He was declared dead at 12:47 last night. There was nothing we could do, Sentinel. I wasn't dreaming, he said in disbelief. He pressed his hands against his face, leaning back in his bed. Then how were you able to save me and not her? To be honest, Sentinel, we don't know what happened with you. When we found you, we had to make sure it was you. What do you mean? He asked, lost, tired, and hopeless. Quinn handed him a mirror. It took the Sentinel a while to realize. He hadn't had long to memorize his face. He quickly remembered the cloaked man and his gun. Oh, no. He put a hand up to his face, feeling around. He combed his fingers through his light brown hair and analyzed his stubble-covered chin from all angles possible. It wasn't the same as before. He saved me. The cloaked man. He put the mirror down. I've phased. I've changed again. He processed it. He was a new man again. But, he thought, why couldn't he save Matrona? He fell back into his bed. Sentinel, there is one bit of good news. What? The Sentinel groaned, sounding defeated. Illuciferium is gone. Quinn's voice wavered a bit. The Sentinel could tell she knew something he didn't. That's not possible, the Sentinel said. You blew it to bits? Just in time, too. Ugar and Quogar were able to save the innocents. You saved us all. But those bombs weren't designed to destroy an entire planet, just the surface. Well, it's gone. You can rest. The Sentinel remembered. He looked down at his hands. I can't. I killed her. Sentinel, don't blame yourself. How could I not? You weren't there. You didn't see it. Rogar tricked me. It was my recklessness. She died by my hand. I'm sorry. The Sentinel stood up and walked over to Matrona's body. So am I.